Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with writer, director, producer, and storyteller with Tamil ancestry, S.Shakthidharan. I'm Nithya Nagarajan, and I'm also a Tamil woman working in the international team at the Australia Council for the Arts, specifically in the Asia engagement space. I come to you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as we journey on a conversation on telling authentic stories. I'd like us all to deeply pause and reflect on whose land we stand, whose waters surround us, and with whose permission we tell these stories. And with that honoring of all who have come before us, I pay my respects to elders past, present, and any First Nations listeners that may be tuned in today. Always was and always will be. I also want to let you know that the discussion today may touch on experiences of discrimination, racism, ableism, and barriers to participation. If you need support for anything that this might bring up for you, we have provided links below. Shakti, thank you for talking with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
For background and to contextualize this conversation, it's part of a series alongside the release of the Australia Council's research overview and public report on diversity in the arts in Australia. The report brings together published and unpublished data and research on representation within the arts and cultural sector in Australia. It assesses equity among our audiences, our participants, our artists, our cultural and creative workforce, and our leaders, and among Australia Council investment and staff, and ends on an urgent call to action. It aims to inform future data collection, research, discussion, but most importantly, action. The body of evidence we have compiled leaves no doubt that we have a long way to go to achieving equity in our arts landscape. Our arts and culture do not yet reflect the diversity of Australia's people. This In Conversation series, though, is not about data, but about people. We want to deeply listen to artists, creative workers, and leaders about their arts practice, their leadership, and their working lives, to share their experience and insights and their thoughts on both the challenges and opportunities ahead. So thank you so much again for joining me today, Shakti. And I'd love to start by asking you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your arts practice and also the ideas and influences that are currently sort of occupying your imagination or driving your artistic inquiry.
My name's Shakti. I should probably describe myself the way my son would. If you're listening on audio, he would say that I have cinnamon skin and that my hair is moved from my top of my head to my face. Yeah, I live in Western Sydney, on the land of the Wongal people, and my family left Sri Lanka when I was a baby, and I've been in Australia since then. And with my Sri Lankan heritage, I have Tamil ancestry. And our original homeland is Jaffna, up in the north of that country. I'm really interested in at the moment, that's driving my artistic inquiry, is this feeling that we're moving from one epoch to another, but we don't know yet what's next. And I've been finding it very useful to try out little tendrils of what could be next in each of the different projects I'm doing. That's the, in terms of the stuff I'm writing, I feel like this given paradigm of consumption kind of driving what we do every day and how we spend our time, and endless growth, and this idea that we can live and grow as societies in a linear progression is starting to come undone. Our cities, I think, really struggle under the kind of concept of endless growth and coming climate change. But at the same time, particularly in Australia, our small towns are finding it really hard to find ways to survive. And so we've got to come up with a different way of understanding how we're on this land. And the pandemic has really thrown a curveball at globalism, and it's going to be interesting to see as we come out of it if we might restore the balance a little bit between what is local and what is global, whether that be our ideas of giant economic markets or just kind of the small scale of how much we know our own immediate community around us. And our relationship with information and stories is really being affected, I think, by our relationship with technology in a way that we never anticipated. And as we shift from one epoch to another, people's natural instinct, I think, is to go a bit more tribal and a bit more into what they want to believe. And that our current way technology is in our lives really, really, really supports that, perhaps as a unhappy coincidence of timing. So all of those things are like massive unearthings and shiftings of our given assumptions of what life used to be like. And so that's just, driving all the projects that I'm looking at, and trying to, as I always do, use the arts to make sense of the world, and hopefully share my questions with audiences so we can try and make sense of it together.
You've just addressed so much. I like so curious as to how you would even start to put that into digestible chunks of process.
Yeah, and that's the craft part, isn't it? Like that's that's the bit where that's our work.
It's a little bit about supporting not just new work but new models, and exactly the kind of juxtaposition of what you're saying of a capitalist structure and then a resistance to that, and framing this support not as an extractive experience but really nurturing people and each other and peers and colleagues in a room. I feel like that's something that anchors your practice, and it manifests not only in your rehearsal rooms but also through your work, with Curious Works and Co-Curious and Homework and bigger institutions like Belvoir.
I think it's different for each stage of your career and what space you move in. There are some given assumptions that are really useful, I think, when thinking about this. And one is that storytelling is immensely powerful. And I don't mean that in some kind of inspiring way. I mean it as a truism. The really important thing, I think, for artists from minority backgrounds is to match the process you're involved in with the kind of power you want to wield, I think, through your storytelling. And for me, what I've learned above all, because obviously we could spend a whole day talking about that question, but above all, what I've learned is how important it is to both match the process with the kind of power you want, as well as to be absolutely transparent. I think transparency is the most important thing. So, for example, you could argue that a group of people might come together to slowly build power. And in that place, kind of grassroots collective work is really useful. And it's often useful for everyone in that group to be all of minority background, or to have certain shared understandings that they can build from. And that's a long-term process. And then sometimes you want to take power and it's important to be mature enough to know that you can't do that without working within institutions and with institutions. And so then you have to be transparent about that and go, well, how are we going to do this? Like, how are we going to embark upon a co-model whereby we are bringing a different process into a place that has had another process for a very long time, and where not necessarily everyone knows that the artwork will involve a different process and a habitual change as well as an outcome change. And so that's a process, I think, of taking power. And then sometimes you want to create a new kind of power, and so I think that's about going, well, how are we going to position and profile a new way of doing things and other types of storytelling in a place that is extremely charismatic. The trick is to make sure that you're not mismatching those spaces, because quite often people think they're slowly building power, but are actually in a scenario within an institution where the only possibilities are to take it or lose it. And sometimes people think they're creating a new kind of power, but they haven't done the work on understanding that they're dealing with power. And so therefore the kind of work that gets created is unconsciously diluted. Yeah, they're the two big takeaways that I found. Actually, our basic principles are a process of listening and responding and being bespoke to what we're hearing. And I would love to find a way to convince more institutions to actually work that way. I think it genuinely creates stronger artwork and would create a more robust industry, and a kind of performing arts that more audiences would want to access. There's always that task, I think, when working with minority groups and nurturing artists. It's always that task of like each project is another layer on shifting the overall dial towards a more listening approach rather than a.
I was reading the first Indigenous chair of the Canada Council, and he was saying what he sees as his work within this remit or role at the Canada Council is harm reduction, and it's actually not just harm reduction for his people, but a belief that reducing harm will ultimately be better for all of society. And then there are the nourishing spaces outside, but as he's growing older, he's also dealing with the spaces in between. And then closer to home here, I guess I've heard Rhoda Roberts speak about custodians of culture, First Nation storytellers as the kind of knowledge keepers, and then her role in the institution as one of a knowledge seeker, and having the institution work responsibly to bridge that gap. And it sounds very much in line with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I think about a lot is the kind of way that so much of our public sphere in our current economic contexts reduce our humanity. And I think a lot of the work we do as storytellers is about recovering our humanity. It's not really something that should be done by just one proportion or one group or of the industry, and it benefits all of us.
This has obviously been a journey of like matching your process or what you're asking of your process to the story you want to tell. I imagine it's, taken you a while to get there. And I'm curious as to what those like barriers were when you were younger, those learning journeys and curves that have evolved you as an artist.
The only reason I'm interested in being an artist is a selfish desire, I guess, to try and make meaning of the world. And I find the arts the best possible way to figure out stuff about the world, about people, like who we are, what we're doing here. And I find stories like the best possible tool to figure that stuff out. The most common experience I've had throughout my career has been a kind of weird dance where people get very excited about my work and its idea format, but terrified by the risks of it. I think the internal struggle for that has been, when I was younger, kind of spending a lot of time wondering if I should give up on that type of practice and kind of limit myself more, because then it would be easier to progress. Even after canning and cracking, like that hasn't really improved. It's not like there's been some kind of rush of support for people to go, oh, okay, that went well, like we trust you now with big ideas. Like that hasn't happened. So
that's surprising. That's so surprising.
I just don't think it exists in our culture. Not for minority artists. I mean, if you're like already doing stuff that's part of like what the most ambitious ideas out there are, then you can continue doing that. I think it's really important for artists to, once they feel like they have a sense of what their voice is, to find peace with it. That's where your strength is going to come from, I think, is what a lot of POC artists face, is that are huge barriers, which is a lack of transparency and a lack of power. It's just, it would be so easy to tell people more about how things really work. It really would. Like, there's just so much demystifying that needs to happen, and accessible, simple language that needs to happen. So I think just shifting the discussion to, which is probably what I think you probably mean by equity, right? To be about sharing power, and also completely demystifying being transparent would, I mentioned those because I think they're two very simple ways that we could reduce some of the biggest barriers that are currently in place.
Yeah. I mean, for the record, you're not asking for too much. Asking to bring your humanity into this space and tell your story on your own terms. It should not be too much to ask for,
No,
but I absolutely, demystifying, I fully agree, is like such a, I mean, it was my own journey as an immigrant as well, coming here later in life. I think the first 4 years I didn't do anything because I was just trying to understand, like let it reveal its complexities to me. And it was,
Yeah, it took me about that long as well. And I think not everyone has the privilege to do that, you know?
No. You did mention counting and cracking. I kind of consciously was steering clear of a conversation. And we won't dwell too much on counting and cracking for those who might be listening and do not know. It is Shakti's most successful work to date. Kind of came out to huge public acclaim, but there are rigorously publicly available archived conversations around it, and we'll post links to them. But are there any sort of thoughts you have on work that is currently cooking for you, specifically through an example of a work in the making that you would like to speak to, where you are using or retooling the lessons learned from a process as long as counting and cracking?
Yeah, all of my projects are doing that. Something I'm finding really rewarding at the moment is now that I'm cool with my process and I've accepted who I am, I'm finding it really rewarding discovering where the meeting points are between that and dominant or mainstream forms of cultural production. I think it's probably in reverse to what a lot of other people do, in the sense that the first kind of 15 years of my practice was very much centered around community arts and cultural development and supporting other people and telling their stories, and kind of big long-term things with community that were about working towards redundancy and social impact as much as arts. And I've only recently come into kind of my own writing and how that community arts methodology interacts with, well, to be frank, like bigger budget theatre and film. So that's been fascinating for me, kind of going, okay, well, I know what my process is. And my wife helped me figure this out the other day, that it's kind of like community arts meets Hindu epic. So I've loved finding ways to build that into, like, you know, how does major film production work, or main stage theatre work? And it's been really great because I think that once you find peace with your process and you kind of campaign for it and you say that that's what it is, you can find those meeting points. It is possible to enact that process as a central way we tell stories in Australia, rather than a periphery way. So that might not lead to more work or something in terms of other people coming to me, but it allows me to have power in saying that can be a main way our institutions tell stories now. And I think probably the other thing is that we talk so much about diversity that we forget that it's actually about similarity as much as it is about difference. And the whole point is to say that we're all the same underneath, and that it's so important to find different ways of coming to that conclusion. And so that's been the other beautiful thing, I think, that's come from counting and cracking, both intra-community and outer-community.
What is the most rewarding work you're doing right now?
I guess in terms of the work I'm doing supporting other people, it's been great to see some long-term change actually start to happen. So Curious Works, which I started that in 2003. I think it became a company in 2005. I was there for 15, 18 years and stepped back in late 2018. And it's been wonderful to see it continue with new leadership, and Co-Curious, and then Belvoir, where I'm doing some structural work as well, and kind of just seeing how post counting and cracking there is the ability to do exactly what we've been talking about, shift the dial in terms of process at an institution like Belvoir. And Co-Curious is about to release a feature film with 8 writers and from Western Sydney and 10 languages in it. And I'm starting to see the possibility of a different mode. I sound so Marxist, don't I? A different mode of production emerging that is sustainable and happening more than once. That's really exciting for me. Yeah, it feels like long-term change.
I mean, the long-term change that you're talking about, it is, as you say, these conversations have been happening for decades, but there does seem to be a momentum of this moment where I think maybe because we've all been locked in, and including everyone in major institutions, there is a deep listening that feels like there is a willingness or an openness of a kind of reorienting of institutional alignment, and whether that is momentum that stays or slows down remains to be seen. But I think people like you are doing that work. It's really alliance building work. That's what
It
it
is.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of boring, it's about the things that you have to do to slowly change what the habits of a people are. And it's like, because that's where we need to shift. Like what we're used to doing has to change. And so it's really about nitty gritty of process and how groups of people work together and how we walk together. I think that's why it doesn't get done sometimes. It's not as exciting as grand statements.
Who've been your biggest advocates through this journey?
For me personally, I think my biggest advocates have been people who were willing to embrace the madness of my big ideas. Like Khaled Sabsabi, I mean, he's a visual artist in his own right, and he's had a long career of all sorts of things, a musician and a community artist and a cultural leader. But, when Curious Works was just starting out, he didn't know me from a bar of soap, and we met, and I told him, I laid the whole thing out. He just embraced it, and we did one workshop in a school, and the deal was that we would do 8 workshops. And at the end of that workshop, him and the school teacher, Sally, this is at Militech, were just loved it so much that they were like, you can just do the next 3 years. That's a lot of responsibility to give a group of young people. But that was, we took it. We took that. We shared power and we took it. The Australia Council's community partnerships team, when I was coming through, were incredibly useful. And that's separate to funding and grants. Like I got rejected as much as the next artist. So many failed applications. But meeting with them and talking to them about practice helped me understand that I could find a home in community arts. And now I've been in it long enough to have my own. There'd be people who disagree with me on where I take it and stuff. And I think there's that kind of really interesting rupture points in community arts, because for me, it's very much a methodology that can be applied to the whole industry. And, and I think that there's disagreement in community arts and what happens when an artist of color steps up to take leadership of a program as opposed to a more dominant person working with the minority community. But through them, I was able to find a home, in the arts, in a place where I felt I belonged. Eamon Flack at Belvoir, Wesley Enoch, who was just, rocked up at Sydney Festival. Like, most people didn't want to do counting and cracking. All my projects now involve alliances of very, very different types of people. I haven't been able to realize anything working in one part of the industry. And so the only way to do it has been to go, well, how about if all of these 5 parts of the industry work together on a project? And so only some types of people like Eamon and Wesley really get that and believe in that. So it's been beautiful finding people who get that we all have to be one small part of a bigger idea and bring our different parts of the industry together. If you find the right people, you don't need many to enact a big change.
Yeah, wow. Just the range from even that little glimpse that you gave us. I feel like if you ever moved on from the arts, you probably have a career in conflict negotiation.
You're not the first person to say it.
Well, staying in that lane of people who've advocated you for a minute, I would, I know your mother as someone who has a dance practice. She's a celebrated artist in Australia in her own right, a maker. And I would love to have a conversation with you about the influence of her and her upbringing on your practice.
Ananda Bali is a Bharatanatyam dancer who's been dancing since she was 6. I think she did her own engagement at 9. And, she built her life as a single mother with me as an only child in Australia through her dance company, because that was all that she knew how to do in terms of providing an income for us. And, through that, she's kind of been a fierce advocate of re-harnessing the potential strength of classical Indian form and South Asian mythologies for kind of really feminist stories and contemporary choreographies that aren't Western centric, that come from the Easter Center. So probably his biggest influence on me has been never taking the West at face value. I've never since day dot ever thought that the way we do things in Australia in terms of the relationships between parents and children, or our schools, or our storytelling, or our economics, or anything like that, is the only way. So I think that's been a real gift. I probably learned my skills in conflict management through her. I've had no choice but to grow up in her art form and in her practice, because that was all of her work and life, and particularly in setting up the company those years, it dominated her life. And so I was just always backstage, basically. And she teaches at home, and I've moved back home in essence, kind of a reversal to help take care of her with my family. And the simplest way of putting it is I haven't separated artistic practice and life like the way that so much of the West does. And I know there's issues with that. I know that those porous boundaries get too porous sometimes. And certainly now when I'm older, I reflect on early years of Curious Works and kind of go, wow, I can't believe I worked that much. I think what's beautiful about it is, on a philosophical or spiritual level, neither of us have ever doubted that, number one, the stage is a sacred space where we all gather to understand what we're doing. But number two, that the only reason we do this artistic stuff is to improve and help us understand what we're doing as humans, and so that's the most beautiful thing about understanding that the storytelling and culture is part of everyday life. And it's, I think a lot of us who come from those worlds of traditional practice are constantly trying to figure that out, aren't we? How to.
Well, speaking of OSCO, I personally work in the Asia engagement space. It was what kind of attracted me to being at council, was how we can have a rooted conversation that is very conscious of local, but to a global dialogue. I'm, with my migrant positionality, I'm always interested in that conversation. And I know that you are developing a work with the Singaporean interdisciplinary makers, SA Collective.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a sneak peek into what's cooking, where things are at?
Yeah, I really love this collaboration because it fits into that other space of, I was saying there's different types of power earlier. The new kind of power, and so the institution work is the taking power and sharing power, and the slowly building power is kind of what I've been doing in the past. And so this is the new kind of power space. And I think, so SADA Collective are a group of Singaporean musicians who work with music and other art forms. And they play a mixture of traditional, mostly Chinese heritage instruments, as well as contemporary electronic. But the group that's come together in that collaboration, so that's between SADA Collective and Kurinji, which is the company I'm doing, that I've set up with a May and that we're doing kind of my independent practice through. The collaborators in that group are myself, May, Jasmine Shepherd, who's an ex-Bangara dancer, and what I love about that process that we've done is that what unites us is that kind of almost everyone in that group has grown up in households where art and spirituality and life are intertwined, and where there's way less boundaries between art forms than in Western practice. And so I've loved the fact that there's this nexus between Indigenous Australia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, where we have all that in solidarity. And we're kind of building an artwork from that as our basis. We all have to figure out how we relate to the land we're on, and we all have to confront the things about our past that we find really tricky. But if I can do it in this artwork, us as a team can do this artwork through a completely different way of making work and a different power as our centrality, and then it says, I hope, that we're dealing with universal issues. The point of diversity really is that there's a different way of thinking and a different lens you can put to this to get to those universal issues. And that's important because it actually makes us feel like more is possible in this world. It changes our sense of what is possible. It frees us. I'm just really excited by making more work from that basis, and trying to figure out, new collective endeavors we can embark upon with that new power. But it's been a fascinating journey for me because it's like so much harder to prosecute that. It's in the small to medium sector. It is like to fundraise all the money yourself. You have to through grants and stuff, and and whereas the kind of working with the dominant institutions is really just about convincing people in positions of power to try a different process. It's fascinating to me kind of how different the different types of power sharing or building is. They are very, very different journeys. But yeah, that's what's cooking with that. And COVID
that
put a
sounds
pause on that.
amazing. It actually, it really just sounds, I mean, from the way you're describing it, it really seems quite like non-linear and very sensory and
Absolutely.
almost a cinematic quality as well, from what I hear.
Yeah, it's kind of like a very surrounding quality. Embracing. I think the kind of the goal of that work would be to help people surrender to it.
Wow. And also then within compositionally what you're talking about, these different powers, it is with institutions, it's really redistribution, isn't it? But then what you're saying here is a kind of a rhizomatic and emergent.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
Hard to put into words. Things.
But new things are like that. New languages as well. Like, I don't know, like then you have to tick a box, right? Is it theatre? So I tick the theatre box and grants.
Beautiful. Well, I would love to close this conversation on kind of a, one word vision for the future. Necessary.
That a lot of us know that storytelling is absolutely necessary. It's what it means to be human. And the models we do for it completely ignore that. And I'm really interested in a future where we bring back models for storytelling, a process for storytelling, to focus on how necessary it is first.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Shakti. I feel like you have covered so much ground, but the crux of everything you said was in that endeavor to recover our collective humanity, I think is a really lovely lilt. And
thank you for those very provoking questions.
Thank you so much. We really value your time, and Australia Council is very grateful that people like you exist, and we will endeavour to make our systems simpler and better, more accessible. It is also a lifetime's work.
It is. I understand how difficult that process is too.
Thanks so much.